Grief has a way of silencing you. It had been a year since the accident, and I still felt like I was screaming into a void that gave nothing back. The road was the only place that felt bearable now. My RV, a moving prison that shielded me from awkward condolences and pitying looks. Photography had once been my joy, my way of freezing beauty in a world that moved too fast. But since Lisa's death, even my camera had become a weight I struggled to lift. The Monongahela National Forest had called to me, promising quiet and solitude. I parked my RV at the edge of a dense grove, the trees towering like sentinels over the crumbling fire road. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a welcome change from the sterile emptiness of my travels. I told myself this trip would be the start of something, a way to reconnect with the world, to feel alive again. The warning signs nailed to the trees didn't faze me at first. Respect the forest, stay on the path. They seemed like standard fare for overzealous park rangers. I dismissed them, eager to set up my camera and lose myself in the lens. I spent the first afternoon photographing deer grazing in a meadow, their movements delicate and deliberate. The light filtered through the canopy in golden beams, transforming the forest into something out of a dream. For a brief moment, I felt the stirrings of my old self, the shutter clicking as I captured the scene. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic knocking echoing through the trees. It was deliberate, almost like a hand rapping against wood. I froze, scanning the forest, but saw nothing. Just the trees, silent and still. I told myself it was just the wind, though the sound lingered in my mind as I returned to the RV. That night, the forest came alive with noises. Heavy footsteps crunched through the underbrush, circling the RV. Branches snapped, followed by a dragging sound, as if something massive was being pulled through the woods. I gripped my flashlight, my pulse hammering, but when I shone the beam into the trees, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found the deer carcass. I'd gone back to the meadow, hoping to capture the same tranquil beauty as the day before. But the scene was transformed. The deer lay torn apart, its ribs exposed like the warped keys of a piano. The ground around it was scorched, the grass blackened in a perfect circle. No tracks led away from the body, just the eerie, unnatural silence. I felt sick but tried to rationalize it. Maybe a lightning strike? A predator I didn't recognize? But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. Later, as I wandered the trail, I ran into a park ranger. He was older, his face leathery and lined, his eyes sharp under a wide-brimmed hat. His name tag read Earl. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and grave. "This part of the forest isn't for wandering." "I'm just taking pictures," I said, forcing a smile. "The forest is beautiful." Earl didn't return the smile. "The forest doesn't belong to us. Stay on the marked trails, and don't go looking for what doesn't want to be found." I wanted to ask more, but he turned and disappeared down the path, his warning hanging heavy in the air. That evening, I saw it. I was reviewing the day's photographs in the RV when the scent hit me, a sharp, acrid smell like burning wood. I glanced out the window and froze. A shadowy figure stood at the forest's edge. It was tall, taller than any man, its form blending with the trees as if it were a part of them. Its eyes glowed a vivid green, piercing through the dusk. I stared, unable to move, as it seemed to tilt its head, studying me. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the figure. The beam cut through the shadows, but the figure was gone. The only trace it left was the faint scent of charred wood. When I went back inside, I found my photographs had changed. The peaceful meadow shots were now twisted, the deer appearing distorted and unnatural. In one frame, the shadowy figure loomed in the background, partially obscured by a tree. My hands shook as I scrolled through the images, a cold dread settling over me. The next day, I made a mistake. Despite Earl's warning, I left the trail. I'd become obsessed with finding the truth, capturing the source of the figure on film. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more wrong it felt. The air grew heavy, the light dimmer. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming jagged arches overhead. Then I found the clearing. The ground was littered with abandoned gear, rotten tents, rusted backpacks, even a child's stuffed animal, its fur matted and faded. The air reeked of decay and burnt wood. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its trunk carved with strange symbols, spirals, hands, and an all-seeing eye. A voice rumbled from the forest, low and resonant, vibrating through my chest. "You do not belong." I stumbled back, my camera falling from my hands. The ground cracked beneath me, revealing writhing roots that pulsed like veins. I turned and ran, the voice following me, louder now, echoing with anger. That night, the warden came for me. The RV shook violently, as if something massive was circling it. The windows fogged with the heat of my panicked breath. Then the door creaked open, though I'd locked it. It stood in the doorway, its form shrouded in shadow, its green eyes burning like embers. The forest warden. Its voice was a deep growl resonating with power. "You disturbed the balance," it said. "You trespassed." "I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I was just taking pictures." The warden stepped closer, the air around it crackling with heat. "The forest is not yours to take." Suddenly, the air shifted, and I was no longer in the RV. I stood in the clearing again, but this time the symbols on the tree glowed with a green light. The warden loomed above me, its shadow stretching impossibly long. It raised a hand, and visions flooded my mind. The accident. Lisa's broken body. My own guilt, the weight of it crushing me. The warden's voice cut through the chaos. "You carry grief like a disease. You taint the balance with your despair." Tears streamed down my face as I fell to my knees. "I don't know how to move on," I whispered. "I don't know how to let go." The warden's gaze burned into me. "Then leave, and do not return." I woke in the RV at dawn, unsure if what I'd experienced was real. The forest was quiet again, the air still and cool. My camera was gone, as were the photographs I'd taken. It was as if the forest had erased every trace of me. As I drove away, I passed a new warning sign nailed to a tree. "Respect the forest, aid." My initials. I don't know if the warden gave me a second chance or if I'll ever truly be free of my grief. But one thing is certain. I'll never forget the eyes in the trees, watching, waiting, protecting what belongs to them. When I first pulled my RV into the campsite near Capitol Reef, I thought I'd found paradise. The red rock canyons rose like ancient cathedrals, their jagged edges glowing in the late afternoon sun. I'd come here to record ambient soundscapes for my latest project, an experimental album blending natural acoustics with music. I was chasing a rumor I'd heard about the canyon's unique echoes, how sounds bounced off the walls in ways that defied logic. It was exactly what I needed. After months of creative burnout and sleepless nights over my failed music career, this was my last-ditch effort to prove I still had something to offer. To prove to myself, to my old bandmates, to everyone who thought I'd never amount to anything, that I could create something extraordinary. The first sign that something was off came almost immediately. As I set up my microphones and clapped my hands to test the acoustics, my voice came back to me in fragments. At first, the echo sounded normal. Then it grew stranger. Instead of repeating my words, it shifted, forming phrases I hadn't spoken. "Come closer," it said. I froze, staring at the canyon walls. It was just a trick of the sound, I told myself, a fluke. But the unease stuck with me as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, casting long shadows over the rocks. That night, I listened back to the recordings in my RV, expecting nothing more than the usual ambient sounds of wind and rustling leaves. Instead, I heard whispers, faint but distinct, layered beneath the echoes of my voice. I turned up the volume, my skin prickling as I made out a single phrase. "Stay with us, Mark." I slammed my laptop shut and rubbed my temples. It had to be interference, static from my equipment, maybe a distant conversation carried on the wind. I wasn't going to let a glitch derail my project. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I locked the RV door before crawling into bed, the strange words still echoing in my mind. The next morning, I decided to hike deeper into the canyon. I wanted to find a spot where the echoes were strongest, hoping to capture something truly unique. The terrain was rugged, the red rock slick beneath my boots, but the beauty of the place kept me going. About an hour in, I noticed something odd. Footprints. At first, I thought they belonged to another hiker, but as I followed them, I realized they matched my boots exactly. My chest tightened. It looked like someone had retraced my steps. Or something. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. The terrain was disorienting, and I'd probably walked in a circle without realizing it. Still, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder as I climbed higher. I found the perfect spot for recording at the mouth of a narrow slot canyon. The walls were high and smooth, forming a natural amphitheater. As I tested the acoustics, the echoes were sharper here, more pronounced. When I spoke, it felt like my own voice was coming back to me from 1,000 directions at once. But the whispers returned too. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, as the canyon seemed to breathe around me. The whispers weren't faint anymore. They were loud enough to be words, overlapping and chaotic, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Help me. You can't leave. Mark." My blood ran cold. I yanked my headphones off, my heart racing. There was no one else here. There couldn't be. I packed up my gear and hurried back to the RV, every nerve screaming at me to get out of the canyon. But when I reached the vehicle, I froze. The whispers were still there, louder now, calling from the cliffs. And then I saw it. A figure, silhouetted against the fading sunlight, standing high on the canyon rim. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. The next day, I drove into town to stock up on supplies. At the general store, I struck up a conversation with the clerk, an older woman with a weathered face and kind eyes. Her name was Ruth, and when I mentioned the strange acoustics of the canyon, her expression darkened. "You've been out by the Red Veil, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low. "Is that what they call it?" I said, trying to sound casual. "It's a great spot for recording." Ruth shook her head. It's not a place you should be, Mark." The sound of my name from her lips startled me. "How did you know my—" She gestured to the business card I'd left on the counter, which had my name printed across the top. I let out a breath, but her serious tone still unnerved me. "They say the canyon keeps the voices of those who die there," she continued. "The echoes. They lure you deeper, feeding off your memories, your regrets. If you're hearing them, you're already too close." I tried to laugh it off. "Just an old ghost story, right?" Her face didn't change. "If you hear your own voice calling you, don't follow it." That night, the voices came back stronger than ever. They didn't just echo. They spoke. I heard my father's voice, sharp and critical, asking why I'd wasted my life chasing dreams that never panned out. I heard my bandmates, their words dripping with disdain, reminding me how I'd let them down. I heard Rachel, my ex, crying as she told me I didn't know how to love anyone but myself. And then I heard my own voice. "Come deeper, Mark," it said, mocking and insistent. "Come find us." I stepped outside the RV, trembling. The air was still, but the whispers surrounded me, louder than the wind. A trail of footprints led away from the campsite, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I knew I shouldn't follow them, but something inside me stirred, a desperate need to know the truth. The trail led me back into the canyon, winding through tight passages that seemed to close in around me. The walls loomed higher, the whispers louder, until I reached a small clearing. In the center was a stone altar, worn and cracked, surrounded by a circle of smooth white rocks. Bones, animal and human, were scattered around it. The whispers converged into a deafening roar and the air seemed to ripple. The shadows around the altar moved, coalescing into humanoid forms. Their faces flickered like static, constantly shifting, but I recognized some of them. My father, Rachel, my bandmates. "Stay with us," they said in unison. "You don't belong anywhere else." I stumbled back, shaking my head. "No, you're not real." The figures laughed, their voices merging into one. "We are your echoes. We are the parts of you that you can't escape. Stay, and you'll never feel alone again." For a moment, the idea tempted me. But then I realized what they were doing, preying on my doubts, my guilt. I gritted my teeth and grabbed the nearest rock, hurling it at the altar. The shadows shrieked, their forms unraveling like smoke. I ran. The canyon twisted around me, the walls narrowing as if trying to trap me. The whispers followed, furious now, but I didn't stop. When I finally burst out into the open air, the dawn light was breaking over the cliffs. The RV was still there, waiting like a lifeline. I drove away without looking back. Weeks later, I listened to the recordings from that night, bracing myself for the worst. Most of the files were corrupted, static and silence, but one survived. It started with the sound of my own voice calling out, and then, faintly beneath it, a whisper, "We'll wait for you." The watchtower was more massive than I expected, a skeletal giant rising out of the desert floor. The wooden beams creaked in the dry wind, weathered and splintered, but still standing after decades of abandonment. As I stepped out of the RV, camera in hand, I couldn't help but feel I was intruding on something ancient and watchful. The place radiated a kind of foreboding that I would have dismissed as overactive imagination if I hadn't come here specifically for the story. I was here to film the first episode of my documentary series, Forgotten Places. My goal was to dig up the history behind places like this and shine a light on their mysteries. This derelict firewatch tower in a remote corner of New Mexico wasn't on any official maps. I'd found it mentioned in a dusty ranger logbook in the archives, alongside cryptic notes about strange disappearances and desert lights. The entries had hooked me instantly. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No birds, no rustling bushes, just the constant hiss of the wind. Perfect for atmospheric shots, I thought, though the emptiness gnawed at me as I set up my gear. Inside the cabin at the base of the tower, I found a rusted filing cabinet, its drawers stuck tight. With a little effort, I pried one open and found what looked like an old journal. The cover was faded, the pages brittle, but the words inside were still legible. The entries belonged to Henry, a fire lookout who'd manned the tower in the 1940s. The first few entries were mundane, reports of smoke sightings, weather updates, but then the tone shifted. The lights appeared again last night just beyond the ridge. They don't move like anything natural. I swear I heard them whispering my name. I flipped further. The voices are louder now. They know I'm here. I think they're trying to lure me out. The last entry chilled me. The light is here again. I don't think I'll come back from this. I spent the afternoon filming around the tower, trying to shake off the unease the journal had stirred. As the sun dipped lower, the desert shadows stretched long and thin, giving the place an otherworldly vibe. I climbed the creaking ladder to the observation deck, hoping to get a panoramic shot of the horizon. The view was breathtaking, endless desert meeting a fiery orange sky. But as I scanned the area through my camera lens, something caught my eye. A faint flicker of light appeared on the horizon, distant and small. At first, I thought it was a car, but the way it moved didn't make sense. It zigzagged erratically, pausing and darting like an insect too fast for any vehicle. My heart pounded as I adjusted the camera, zooming in. The light vanished. That night, I set up camp near the base of the tower, confident the footage I'd captured would make a strong opening for the documentary. I sat inside the RV, reviewing the day's recordings. Everything looked as expected until I reached the panoramic shot from the observation deck. In several frames, there was a figure at the top of the tower. I froze, staring at the grainy outline. It was humanoid, standing perfectly still, though I was certain I'd been alone up there. The figure disappeared frame by frame, fading into thin air. A chill ran through me, but I told myself it was an optical illusion, a trick of the light or a glitch in the footage. I locked the RV doors and tried to sleep. I woke to the sound of something brushing against the side of the RV. It was faint at first, like the wind carrying sand, but it grew louder. A deliberate scraping, slow and rhythmic. I grabbed a flashlight and I peered out the window. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint outline of the tower against the starlit sky. But then I saw it, a light, flickering just beyond the RV, hovering like a firefly. It moved closer, swaying gently, almost beckoning. My stomach tightened. The journal's words echoed in my head. They're trying to lure me out. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, watching the light move in slow, hypnotic patterns. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it winked out. The next morning, I found burn marks near the base of the tower, dark, charred spots in the dirt, as if a fire had been lit there recently. But there was no ash, no debris, nothing to explain them. The air smelled faintly of ozone, sharp and electric. Determined to find answers, I climbed the tower again, my camera strapped to my chest. At the top, I found more burn marks, this time etched into the wooden floorboards near the trap door. I also found an old photograph tucked into a corner. It was faded, showing a man I assumed was Henry standing by the tower. But in the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure. I stared at the photo, my pulse racing. I needed to know more. That night, the lights returned. I was reviewing footage in the RV when I saw them through the window. At first, it was just one, a faint orb bobbing in the distance. But then another appeared, and another. Soon, there were dozens, forming a ring around the tower. I grabbed my camera and stepped outside, heart hammering. The lights seemed to react to me, growing brighter and moving closer. I filmed as they circled the tower, their movements too deliberate, too intelligent. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible over the wind. But they grew louder, clearer, voices overlapping, speaking my name. "Jamie, come closer." I stumbled back toward the RV, but the lights followed, their glow intensified. My camera blinked off, the screen glitching before going dark. I dropped it and ran, the whispers turning into an overwhelming cacophony. Desperate for answers, I opened Henry's journal, flipping through the pages frantically. The entries seemed to pulse under my fingers, the ink darker than before. One passage stood out. "The lights aren't natural. They're alive. They feed on regret, pulling you toward them until you're nothing but a shadow. Don't listen to them. Don't follow." The lights surrounded the RV now, their glow seeping through the windows. I heard the door creak, though I'd locked it. Then the trapdoor above me opened, and I felt a presence inside the cabin. I spun around, and there it was. A humanoid figure, its form shifting like smoke, its eyes glowing with the same searing light as the orbs. It didn't speak, but I felt its message. I belonged to it now. I don't know how I found the strength to move. Maybe it was instinct, maybe desperation, but I grabbed Henry's journal and ran outside. The lights swarmed around me, blinding and hot. Their whispers became screams, accusing me of cowardice, failure, and worse. "You'll join us," they hissed, "just like him." I ripped a lighter from my pocket and set the journal on fire. The flames roared, unnaturally bright, consuming the brittle pages. The lights recoiled, their glow flickering. The figure screamed, its form distorting before vanishing into the night. By the time the flames died, the lights were gone. The tower loomed silently behind me, its shadow long and still. I packed my gear and left at dawn, refusing to look back. But even now, as I edit this footage, the memories haunt me. My camera glitched during the escape, but in one frame, I see the figure standing atop the tower, its glowing eyes staring directly at me. And last night, I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "The light remembers." Attached was a photo of the watchtower. The figure was still there, waiting. I pulled my RV into the lot at Old Creek Hollow, the tires crunching over gravel as the forest closed in around me. The place had been abandoned for decades, but it was still marked on old maps as a campground. The air here felt wrong, too still, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence and the faint scent of damp earth. Perfect for writing, I told myself. I'd come here to finish my book, At least, that was the excuse. The truth was, I was running from something I'd carried with me since I was a kid. My childhood friend Tyler disappeared when we were 10 years old. We'd gone exploring in the woods near my house, and I ran when he called for help. I never told anyone what really happened, not even the police. The weight of that day had grown heavier over the years, suffocating me. This trip was supposed to clear my head, but as I stepped out of the RV and looked into the dark expanse of trees, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. The first night, I met Jenny Moore. She arrived at the campground just as the sun was dipping below the treetops, her hiking boots caked with mud and a camera slung around her neck. "You're brave, staying here alone," she said, eyeing my RV. She looked a few years younger than me, with a confident, outdoorsy vibe. "Not much braver than you," I replied. She smiled. "I'm here researching the history of Old Creek Hollow. Fascinating place. Haunted as hell, if you believe the stories." "Haunted?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You haven't heard of the Hollow Man?" she asked, leaning on her hiking pole. "No," I said, feeling a flicker of unease. "What's that?" She glanced towards the trees where the light was fading fast. "They say he's a shadow that takes human form. He appears to people with secrets, with guilt, makes them face their worst fears. Some disappear. Others, well, they aren't the same after." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like a great bedtime story." She shrugged. "Believe what you want. Just don't wander too far into the hollow." That night, I had the first dream. I was back in the woods where Tyler and I had played as kids. I saw him, standing in the distance, calling my name. His voice was thin, desperate. "Ryan, help me." I tried to run toward him, but my legs wouldn't move. The forest seemed to stretch, the trees growing taller, their shadows deeper. Then I saw it, a figure standing behind Tyler, tall, thin, and featureless, the Hollow Man. I woke up drenched in sweat, the RV's interior filled with shadows cast by the moonlight. It was just a dream, I told myself, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next morning, I explored the campground, hoping a walk would clear my head. The trails were overgrown, the old ranger station collapsed into a heap of moss-covered wood. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I started noticing strange symbols carved into the trees, stick figures, spirals, and crude runes I couldn't decipher. Jenny caught up with me as I was photographing one of the carvings. "You've seen those too, huh?" she asked. "Any idea what they mean?" I asked. "Not exactly," she said, "but they're old. I think they were left by the people who built the campground. Maybe as a warning." "A warning for what?" I asked. Jenny hesitated. "For him, the Hollow Man." By late afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, though the sky was clear. I set up my laptop in the RV, determined to write, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I kept glancing out the window, feeling like I was being watched. Then I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. "Ryan." I froze. It came again, softer this time, carried on the wind. "Ryan." I stepped outside, my heart hammering. The forest was still, but the voice was closer now, coming from deeper in the hollow. "Ryan, help me." My stomach turned. It wasn't just any voice, it was Tyler's. I found Jenny at the edge of the hollow, setting up her camera. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked without looking at me. I nodded. It's not possible. He's gone. Jenny turned to me, her face pale. The hollow man uses what you fear, what you regret. He's trying to draw you in. This is insane, I said, running a hand through my hair. It's just stress, guilt, my brain playing tricks on me. Maybe, Jenny said, but don't go into the hollow. Once you do, he has you. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tyler. I heard his voice calling for help, accusing me of abandoning him. Around midnight, I gave up and stepped outside to get some air. The forest was alive with shadows. The carvings on the trees seemed to shift in the moonlight, the stick figures stretching, the spirals spinning. And then I saw him. The hollow man. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his tall, featureless form blending with the shadows. My chest tightened, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling. Ryan, he whispered, his voice a dozen layered whispers, come closer. I bolted back into the RV, slamming the door shut. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, echoing in my mind until I thought I would scream. The next day, Jenny and I went deeper into the hollow, searching for answers. I told her about the dream, about Tyler, about the guilt I'd carried all these years. I ran away, I admitted. He called for help, and I ran. I was scared. I didn't want to get in trouble. Jenny placed a hand on my shoulder. The hollow man preys on that. If you want to stop him, you have to confront it. We found an old creek bed at the heart of the hollow, its water stagnant and dark. Nearby was a clearing with more carvings, this time in the dirt. One of them was a name, Tyler. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from all directions. You left me, the voice said. Tyler's voice. The hollow man appeared, rising from the creek like a shadow given form. He loomed over me, his featureless face inches from mine. Admit it, he whispered. Say it. Tears streamed down my face. I'm sorry, I choked out. I was scared. I should have stayed. I should have helped you. I'm so sorry. The hollow man froze. The forest grew silent. Then he dissolved into the shadows, leaving me kneeling in the dirt. Jenny helped me back to the RV. The air felt lighter now, the forest less oppressive. As we packed up, she gave me a small smile. You faced him, she said. Not many people do. I nodded, though I felt hollow inside. I'd confronted my past, but it hadn't brought Tyler back. Weeks later, I finished my book. It wasn't what I'd planned. It was about Tyler, about the hollow man, about guilt and fear and the things we carry. It was the hardest thing I'd ever written. A few days after I submitted the manuscript, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a stick figure carved from black wood, the same symbol I'd seen in the hollow. There was no note, but I didn't need one. The hollow man hadn't forgotten, and neither would I. The first thing I noticed about Coldwater Lake was how still it was. Not just the water, but the whole place. The silence was thick, almost unnatural, and the lake's surface mirrored the overcast sky perfectly, broken only by the occasional ripple. It felt like stepping into another world, one where even the air didn't move. I parked my RV at the edge of the campground, close enough to see the lake through the trees. This was supposed to be the place where I'd confront my fears, proved to myself that I could move past what happened. It had been 3 years since the accident. 3 years since that client drowned on my watch. 3 years since I left my career as a wilderness guide behind. I hadn't set foot in the water since, but I needed to. I needed to find my courage again. As I unpacked, I spotted someone a few sites over. A man with a wiry build, wearing a threadbare jacket, stood next to a tent. His gear looked weathered, like he'd been here for weeks. When our eyes met, he nodded once but didn't smile. I was glad for the company. The isolation was already starting to press down on me. I met him properly later that evening as I walked down to the lake with my camera. He was crouched by the water, tossing pebbles into the lake. Each one made a ripple that spread and disappeared into the glassy surface. "Evening," I said. He glanced up, squinting at me. "You're new?" "Just got here," I replied. "Daniel Hayes." "Travis," he said, "how long are you staying?" "A few days, maybe more," I said. "Just here to clear my head, take some pictures." Travis snorted. "Clear your head? At Coldwater?" He shook his head. "Bad place for that." "What do you mean?" I asked, though his tone made me uneasy. He stood, brushing dirt off his hands. "This place doesn't clear your head. It gets in it." He pointed to the water. "You ever hear about the lurker?" I almost laughed, but stopped when I saw his face. He wasn't joking. "No," I said carefully. "What's the lurker?" Travis walked closer, lowering his voice. "Something lives in that lake. It's not a fish or an animal, it's something else. It waits down in the deep. Sometimes it comes up. You'll hear voices, see things. It likes to play with your head before it takes you." "Sounds like a ghost story," I said, forcing a smile. Travis's expression didn't change. "You'll see." He turned and walked back toward his tent, leaving me alone by the water. That night, the first ripple of doubt crept into my mind. I was lying in bed, staring at the RV ceiling when I heard it. A faint splashing sound like someone wading into the lake. I sat up listening. The splashing stopped, but a few seconds later I heard something else. A voice. "Daniel." It was faint, but unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The campground was empty and the lake was still, but I could have sworn the voice came from the water. "Daniel, help me!" My stomach turned. It wasn't just any voice, it was her voice. The client I'd lost, the one I couldn't save. I stumbled back inside the RV, locking the door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told myself it was my imagination. Stress, guilt, the brain playing tricks. I spent the day hiking around the lake, taking photos of the forest and the cliffs that loomed over the water. But the further I went, the more I noticed strange things. I found an old rowboat washed up on the shore, its hull covered in long, deep scratches that didn't look like they came from rocks. Nearby, there was a set of footprints leading from the water into the woods, but they didn't come back out. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A bear, maybe, or some kind of animal I didn't know about. But the unease settled deeper into my chest. That night, I heard the voice again. "Daniel?" It was closer this time, coming from right outside the RV. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on wet footprints leading up from the lake to my RV. They stopped just a few feet from the door. "Daniel, help me!" The voice sent a shiver down my spine. I turned the flashlight toward the lake, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the water, but when I blinked, it was gone. I found Travis the next morning, pacing near the water's edge. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked. "I don't know what I heard," I said. "Maybe it's just the way the sound travels over the water." Travis shook his head violently. "No, it's the lurker. It knows you're here. It knows what you've done." I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Travis pointed to the lake. "It feeds on guilt, fear. It'll drag you in, just like it did to the others." "Others?" I asked. He nodded. "People go missing here all the time. The rangers say it's accidents, but it's not. The lurker takes them." I didn't want to believe him, but that night, everything fell apart. I was sitting by the fire when the splashing started again. This time it was louder, like someone was thrashing in the water. I stood, heart racing, and turned toward the lake. "Help me!" the voice screamed. It was her voice again, but this time it was desperate, panicked. Against my better judgment, I ran to the water's edge. The lake was dark, but I saw ripples spreading across the surface, moving toward me. "Daniel!" the voice screamed again. "Please!" My foot slipped into the water, and it was freezing, far colder than it should have been. I staggered back just as the ripples reached the shore. For a split second, I saw something beneath the surface. A shadowy figure, its eyes glowing faintly. I ran. Travis found me in the morning, sitting outside the RV, shaking. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said. I nodded. "What do I do?" Travis hesitated, then said, "There's a carving on the cliffs above the deepest part of the lake. It's the center of its power. You want to stop it, you go there." We climbed the cliffs that afternoon, the air growing colder as we ascended. At the top, we found it. A circular carving etched into the rock, its patterns spiraling inward like a vortex. Travis's face went pale. "This is it," he said. As we stood there, the lake below began to churn, its surface breaking into waves despite the still air. A low, guttural sound echoed from the depths, vibrating through the ground. "It's angry," Travis muttered. Suddenly, I heard her voice again. "Daniel, why did you leave me?" I turned, and she was standing there, her form flickering like a mirage. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale and distorted. "You left me," she said, stepping closer. "It's not her," Travis yelled. "It's the lurker. Don't let it touch you." But I couldn't move. The guilt was too heavy, the memory too fresh. She reached out, her hand brushing my arm, and I felt a cold that burned. Desperate, Travis pulled me back and threw a handful of salt into the air. The figure screamed, its form dissolving into mist. The lake roared below, waves crashing against the cliffs. I grabbed a rock and smashed the carving. The ground shook, and the lake stilled. We left Coldwater Lake that evening, neither of us speaking. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw a figure standing on the shore, watching. I haven't been near water since. But sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the voice. "Daniel." The first thing you notice about whispering pines is the silence. It's the kind that isn't natural, the kind that feels too deliberate, like something is holding its breath, watching. As I pulled my RV into the deserted campground, the towering Douglas firs loomed over me, their branches twisted and clawed like they were trying to reach for something, or someone. It was exactly what I needed. I'd told myself I came here to photograph the wildlife and the famous mist that clings to these forests. But if I was being honest, I was running. From my job, from people, and from the memory of a rainy night 5 years ago. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. This trip wasn't about that. It was about peace, isolation, and maybe finally getting a good shot for my portfolio. After I parked, I stepped out into the cool, damp air. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the faint smell of moss and decaying leaves filled my lungs. The campground was empty except for a small cabin near the edge of the forest. As I unloaded my gear, an older woman emerged from the cabin. She had wild gray hair, piercing eyes, and a jacket so worn it looked like it was part of her. "You must be Alex," she said, her voice low and rough like the crackle of a fire. "How'd you know that?" I asked. "Only one person reserved a site this week." She gave me a small, unreadable smile. "Eleanor Crandall. Folks call me Ellie. I'm the caretaker." "Nice to meet you." I nodded toward the forest. "It's beautiful out here." "Beautiful and dangerous," she said, her tone shifting. "Whispering Pines isn't a place for unsettled souls." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Ellie shrugged, her eyes darting to the trees. "This forest has a way of knowing what you're carrying. It doesn't like secrets." She paused. "Keep your conscience clean, Alex." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked back to her cabin, disappearing into the shadows. I laughed nervously and shook my head. Just a superstitious old woman, I told myself. That night, I sat by the campfire, my camera resting on my lap. The flames crackled softly, and the mist rolled in, thick and heavy, wrapping around the trees like a shroud. I tried to focus on the beauty of the place, but Ellie's words lingered in my mind. The first sound came just after midnight. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic ding-ding. I tilted my head, listening. It came again, louder this time. A bell, a bicycle bell. My breath caught. I hadn't heard that sound in years, not since... No, it wasn't possible. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam of light cut through the mist, illuminating only gnarled branches and the occasional patch of moss. Nothing else. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, and human-shaped, standing between the trees. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The shadow vanished. I stumbled back to my RV, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding, and I told myself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found tire tracks in the dirt near my RV, bicycle tracks. They led into the forest and disappeared. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to focus. I wasn't going to let some strange noises or shadows ruin this trip. I packed my camera and hiked into the forest, determined to get some good shots. The trees seemed taller today, their branches pressing in closer. The air was heavier, and the silence was absolute. As I walked, I noticed strange things. Claw-like gouges in the bark of some trees, an old rusted bicycle leaning against a trunk, and, most unsettling of all, words scratched into the dirt on the trail. "You left me." I froze, staring at the message. My throat tightened. "It's a coincidence," I whispered. "Just some prank." The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper. "Alex." I spun around, my breath catching. No one was there. When I returned to the campground, Ellie was waiting for me, standing by the fire pit. Her expression was grim. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked. I didn't respond. My hands were shaking too much to answer. She sighed. "The forest knows, Alex. It knows what you've done." "I don't know what you're talking about," I snapped, though my voice betrayed me. Ellie stepped closer, her eyes boring into mine. "You can't run from it. The Revenant won't let you." My blood ran cold. "Revenant?" "A spirit of someone wronged in life," she explained. "It latches onto guilt, feeds on it, grows stronger until it consumes you. I've seen it happen before." I wanted to laugh, to call her crazy, but the words caught in my throat. The bell, the shadow, the message in the dirt. I couldn't deny it anymore. "What do?" I whispered. Ellie's expression softened. "You face it. You tell the truth." That night, the Revenant came for me. It started with the bell, louder this time, circling my RV. Then came the whispers, my name spoken in a voice I hadn't heard in years. I stayed inside, clutching a flashlight like it was a weapon, but the lights flickered and died. The temperature plummeted, and the walls of the RV creaked under some unseen pressure. "Why did you leave me?" the voice asked right outside the door. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my head spinning. The memory I'd been suppressing for years came rushing back. The rain, the cyclist, the thud as my car struck them. The way I'd driven away, too scared to stop, too selfish to take responsibility. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." The door rattled, and the shadow appeared in the window, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. It reached for me, its hand passing through the glass. Desperate, I grabbed my camera and ran outside. The Revenant stood by the fire pit now, its form clearer than before. It looked like him, the cyclist. His face was pale and blurred, but his eyes were filled with fury. "You left me," it said again. "I know," I sobbed. "I was a coward. I should have stayed. I should have helped you." The Revenant stepped closer, its hand outstretched. I backed away until I tripped, landing hard on the dirt. My camera slipped from my hands, cracking against a rock. The lens shattered. I looked up, and the Revenant froze. Its gaze fell to the camera, then back to me. I understood. I crawled to the camera and smashed it with a rock. It was my most prized possession, the thing I'd used to hide from the world, to build a life around lies and denial. Destroying it felt like ripping out a piece of myself. The Revenant let out a low, mournful sound, then began to dissolve. Its form broke apart, scattering like mist in the wind. The forest grew silent again. The next morning, I packed up and left Whispering Pines. Ellie watched from her cabin, giving me a small nod as I drove away. I didn't know if I deserved her forgiveness, but I felt lighter somehow, like the forest had released me. Weeks later, I walked into a police station and told them everything about the accident. It wouldn't bring him back, but it was the only way to make things right. A few days after that, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a photograph of my RV at Whispering Pines, taken from the edge of the forest. In the background, I could see a faint shadow standing among the trees. The Revenant was gone, but the forest, I realized, would never forget. When I first drove into Coconino National Forest, the quiet was a relief. The hum of traffic and constant notifications on my phone had been replaced by the soft whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of birds. This trip was supposed to be a break from the world. A week without tech, no phone, no emails, no digital distractions. Just me, an old shortwave radio my dad left me, and the forest. My dad had always talked about this place. He used to visit when I was a kid, before life got complicated. He said the air here was different, crisp and clean, a world untouched by time. I thought maybe coming here would make me feel closer to him, even though he'd been gone for 6 months now. It still didn't feel real. I parked my RV in a remote clearing near Sedona, surrounded by towering red rocks and dense pine trees. The view was stunning, the kind of beauty that makes you forget about everything else. I set up camp, unpacked my gear, and decided to tinker with the radio that night. I wasn't expecting to hear anything. I just wanted to hear the comforting hiss of static, a sound that reminded me of my dad. The first night was peaceful enough until I turned on the radio. I flipped through frequencies, listening to the static rise and fall. Occasionally, I'd catch faint crackles of distant broadcasts, but nothing clear. Then, just as I was about to turn it off, a voice broke through. "Don't let it find you." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The voice was faint, distorted, like it was coming from far away. I turned the dial, but the signal disappeared into static. My heart was racing, but I laughed it off. Probably some old broadcast bouncing around the atmosphere, I told myself. Still, I turned the radio off and went to bed, leaving the odd message behind me. The next morning, I explored the forest. The sun was warm, the air sharp with the scent of pine. I hiked along the trails, taking photos of the jagged red cliffs and the sprawling greenery. But something felt off. The animals were skittish. A rabbit darted across my path, its ears twitching as if it sensed something I couldn't. Birds fluttered from the trees, their calls sharp and frantic. On my way back to the RV, I noticed strange carvings on a tree near my campsite. They looked like waveforms, jagged lines etched deep into the bark. At first, I thought it was graffiti, but the precision was unnerving. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. I snapped a photo and made a mental note to look it up later. When I got back, I realized something was wrong. My phone, which I'd left on the counter, was completely dead. So was my GPS. I tried plugging them into the solar charger, but it wouldn't work either. The batteries in my flashlight were drained, and even the RV's backup generator struggled to start. It didn't make sense. Everything had been fully charged the night before. That night, the radio came on by itself. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the faint hum of static. I sat up, my heart pounding. The radio was on, its dials glowing softly in the dark. I hadn't touched it since the night before. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous for talking to an empty room. The static shifted, and a voice came through. It was clearer this time, though still distorted. "The static, it's alive. It's watching you." I grabbed the radio and turned the dial, trying to find the source. The voice faded in and out, but its tone was urgent, almost pleading. "You have to leave. It feeds on—" The signal cut out, replaced by a sharp burst of static that made me wince. I stared at the radio, my hands trembling. The air in the RV felt heavy, oppressive. I turned the radio off and shoved it into a drawer, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The next day, I found the campsite. I'd gone out to explore again, hoping to clear my head. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. That's when I stumbled upon it. A clearing littered with old camping gear. A tent torn and weathered. A rusted stove. A journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I flipped through the journal, the words scrawled in frantic handwriting. There's something in the static. My devices won't work. It's messing with them. I saw it last night. It looked like me. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. If you find this, don't let it in. I looked around the clearing, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm. I hurried back to the RV, my pulse racing. That night, the static came for me. It started with the lights. They flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. Then the radio turned on, blasting static at full volume. I yanked it from the drawer and smashed the power button, but it didn't stop. The static grew louder, sharper, like it was trying to crawl into my skull. Then I saw it. A figure stood outside the RV, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. It was tall and humanoid, but its edges flickered like a glitch in a video. Its face was smooth, featureless, yet I felt its gaze boring into me. As I stared, it tilted its head, the motion jerky and unnatural. The radio crackled and the voice returned. This time it wasn't a warning. It was mocking. "Evan, come outside." The voice was mine. I barricaded myself in the RV, my mind racing. I remembered the journal, the warning not to let it in. But the static was everywhere now, seeping into the walls, filling the air with an electric hum. The lights flickered violently, and the figure outside began to move. It didn't walk. It glided, its form shifting and distorting as it circled the RV. I heard tapping on the windows, soft at first, then louder. The static voice spoke again, alternating between my own and my father's. "Don't you miss him, Evan? He's waiting." I screamed, grabbing the radio and throwing it against the wall. It shattered, the pieces scattering across the floor. For a moment, the static stopped and the light steadied. But then it came back, stronger than before. I remembered the carvings on the tree, the strange waveforms. They weren't just symbols, they were a barrier. If the static was alive, feeding on energy, then maybe I could disrupt it. I tore apart my equipment, cobbling together an improvised EMP device using parts from my broken gadgets. It wasn't perfect, but it was all I had. As the static grew louder, the figure pounding on the RV door, I activated the device. A burst of light and sound erupted, shaking the RV. The static let out a shriek, a distorted, inhuman wail that made my ears bleed. The figure outside flickered violently, its form collapsing in on itself before vanishing into the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. At dawn, the forest felt normal again. The air was calm, the sunlight warm against my skin. But the RV was damaged, its electronics fried. I salvaged what I could and left, the shortwave radio line shattered on the floor. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trees were still, the road empty, but for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement. Tall, distorted figures standing between the pines, watching me leave. I haven't touched another radio since. I arrived at Shoshone National Forest just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. the sky painted in streaks of pink and gold. The world was quiet here, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you've stumbled into another time. That's what I needed. A break from the noise, from the deadlines, and, frankly, from people. The clearing I'd picked was remote, a patch of flat earth surrounded by towering pines that swayed lazily in the evening breeze. Perfect for my work. I was here to study the effects of climate change on isolated ecosystems, a last-minute addition to my report for an upcoming environmental conference. But more than that, I was here to be alone. Just me, the forest, and my thoughts. The woman at the gas station had raised an eyebrow when I mentioned my destination. Black Ridge, I'd said, and she'd glanced out the window as though checking for something behind me. People don't go up there much, she'd said, her voice clipped. Strange things happen in those woods. I'd smiled politely and paid for my fuel. Every small town had its stories, and I wasn't about to let folklore derail my schedule. The first day was uneventful. I set up camp near the edge of the ridge, my RV a lone speck of modernity in the wild expanse of trees. My instruments hummed softly, monitoring air quality, soil moisture, and other data points I'd later crunch into charts and graphs. The weather was perfect, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you feel alive. But as the sun set, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavier, the breeze dying until the trees stood motionless. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and even the chirping of crickets faded into silence. I dismissed it as a trick of the mind, fatigue from the long drive. Then I heard it. Faint at first, a rhythmic tapping on the side of the RV. I froze, my pen hovering over my notebook. It sounded deliberate, like someone or something testing the walls. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. "Hello?" My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. The forest stared back, dark and unmoving. I shone the flashlight along the RV's side, expecting to find a branch swaying in the breeze. But there was nothing. No wind, no branches, no sign of what could have made the sound. I lingered for a moment, then went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the forest, my equipment strapped to my back. The trees loomed tall and ancient, their bark gnarled like old scars. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, the kind of place where you could almost believe in the supernatural. But as I hiked, something felt wrong. The wildlife was skittish. A deer bolted at the slightest sound, and birds erupted from the canopy in frantic bursts. The air smelled strange, like metal and earth after a lightning strike. And then I found the grove. It was a circle of trees, their bases marked with perfect, charred rings. The ground within the circle was barren, the soil dry and cracked as though nothing had grown there in years. The air was warmer here, almost humid, and I could feel a faint vibration in my chest, like the low hum of a distant engine. I stepped into the circle, my boots crunching on the brittle earth. The vibration grew stronger, and I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. My instruments beeped wildly, their readings spiking in ways that didn't make sense. I snapped a few photos and moved on, my heart beating faster than I cared to admit. That night, the tapping returned. I'd just settled into bed when it started, louder this time. It came from the roof, a steady, deliberate knock. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a branch. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed onto the RV roof, half expecting to find an animal or maybe some local kid playing a prank. But the roof was empty. the metal cold beneath my hands. As I scanned the forest, my light caught movement. A tall figure standing at the edge of the clearing. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnaturally rigid. My flashlight flickered, and when the beam steadied, the figure was gone. I climbed down and locked the door, my hands shaking. Sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I stumbled across an abandoned campsite. A torn tent flapped weakly in the breeze, its poles bent at odd angles. Gear lay scattered across the ground. Cooking utensils, a backpack, a flashlight crusted with dirt. Everything was covered in a fine layer of ash. I found a journal among the debris, its pages warped and smeared. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about the weather, sightings of deer. But the last few were frantic, the handwriting jagged. "Something's out here. I hear it at night, tapping on the trees. I saw it today. It looks human, but it's not. If you find this, don't stay. Don't let them take you." I stuffed the journal into my pack, my pulse hammering. Whatever had happened here wasn't my problem, I told myself, but the words stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. That evening, the fog rolled in. It came suddenly, a dense wall of gray that swallowed the forest. The world outside my RV disappeared, muffled and distorted. The tapping began again, first on the windows, then on the walls. My flashlight flickered as I stepped outside, the beam cutting through the haze. The figures were back, more of them this time. They stood in a loose circle around the RV, their forms flickering like static on an old TV. They didn't move, but their presence pressed against me, heavy and suffocating. One of them stepped closer, and I finally saw its face, or lack of one. Its features were smooth, featureless, as if carved from liquid shadow. It raised a long, spindly arm, pointing towards the forest. The humming started then, low and resonant, vibrating through my chest. The figures vanished into the fog, but the sound remained, growing louder. I don't know why I followed them. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the humming, pulling me forward like a siren song. The fog thickened as I stumbled through the forest, the light from my flashlight barely penetrating the gray. The trees loomed like giants, their branches clawing at the sky. I reached the grove again, though I couldn't remember how. The charred circles glowed faintly, their edges pulsing in time with the humming. And in the center stood the harvesters. There were 3 of them, their forms shifting and flickering like shadows caught in a storm. They moved in perfect unison, their long arms weaving patterns in the air. I realized they weren't just standing there, they were harvesting. Plants, animals, even the earth itself dissolved into ash and light, drawn toward them like moths to a flame. I felt a pull in my chest, an overwhelming urge to step closer. The harvesters turned to me, their heads tilting in unison. One of them raised its arm, beckoning. Panic jolted me out of my trance. I dropped my flashlight and fumbled for the journal, flipping to the last page. The symbols etched into the dirt around the campsite, the same ones now glowing in the grove. They weren't random. They were a barrier. I grabbed a stick and began carving the symbols into the dirt around me, my hands shaking. The humming grew louder, the harvesters stepping closer. My vision blurred, my head pounding with the sound. The final symbol completed, the grove erupted in light. The ground shook, the air filled with a deafening shriek as the harvesters recoiled, their forms collapsing into the fog. The light faded, and the grove fell silent. At dawn, the fog lifted. The grove was gone, replaced by an ordinary stretch of forest. But I knew better. Whatever I'd seen was still there, lurking just out of sight. I drove away, the RV's engine a comforting hum beneath me. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw them, 3 shadowy figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I didn't look back. The first time I saw the cemetery of the trees, I felt something in me crack open. I'd driven my RV into the Savage Gulf State Natural Area, deep in the rugged wilderness of Tennessee, looking for solitude. I told myself I wanted peace, a quiet place to clear my mind, but I knew better. I was running from a house too empty, a bed too cold, and the suffocating guilt I carried every day since losing Lauren. She'd loved the outdoors, always dragging me on hikes I didn't want to take. Now, here I was, wandering the wilderness alone, hoping to feel her presence in the wind and trees. I'd chosen this spot for its isolation. The park was vast and wild, full of deep gorges and thick forest. I parked the RV near an old trailhead and set off with nothing but my pack and a vague sense of purpose. By mid-afternoon, the trail had narrowed, twisting into a shadowy grove of blackened trees. They were stunted and gnarled, their bark charred and peeling as if scorched in a fire long ago. Their branches reached skyward like skeletal hands, and the ground beneath them was barren, devoid of undergrowth. The air grew colder as I approached, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the sunlit trail behind me. I stood there, staring. The place felt wrong, too still, too quiet, but it also felt familiar. A pull I couldn't explain. I snapped a photo, shivering as a gust of wind whispered through the grove. It sounded like a sigh. I told myself it was nothing and moved on. That night, back at the RV, I couldn't shake the image of the grove. The trees had looked almost alive, their twisted limbs frozen mid-reach. I reviewed the photos on my camera. The grove was just as I remembered, but the trees looked darker, their shapes more distorted. One photo made my breath catch. The branches formed a shape that looked like a face, its mouth open in a silent scream. I laughed nervously, closing the camera. It was just my imagination. I climbed into bed, the RV rocking slightly in the evening breeze. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I remembered was waking to a sound. Whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Words. I couldn't make them out, but they surrounded me, faint and distant. I sat up, my heart pounding, and peered out the window. The forest was dark, impenetrable, but the whispers were louder now, rising and falling like a conversation just out of reach. I opened the door and stepped into the cool night air, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called, feeling foolish. The whispers stopped. The forest fell silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I stood there, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand, until the chill drove me back inside. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I hiked back to the grove. The trail felt different, steeper, the air heavier. When I reached the cemetery of the trees, I stopped short. Something had changed. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisted into new unnatural shapes. The faint scent of decay hung in the air, and the ground felt soft, like it might give way under my boots. I walked slowly among the trees, my pulse quickening. Carved into the bark were strange symbols, Lines, spirals, and crude faces. They hadn't been there yesterday. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, its edges too sharp to be old. It almost looked fresh. The whispering returned. I spun around, my flashlight beam jerking between the trees. The whispers were louder now, unmistakable, and one voice rose above the others. "Mark." My breath hitched. The voice was soft, familiar, unmistakable. Lauren. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" The forest gave no answer, only the faint rustle of wind through the trees. I turned and ran, the sound of my boots echoing in the stillness. That night, I couldn't stop hearing her voice. It was faint at first, like a memory, but it grew stronger, more insistent. "Mark, come back." It was impossible, I told myself. Lauren was gone, buried beneath a simple gravestone back in Ohio. This couldn't be real. But the voice persisted, calling to me, pleading. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the table in the RV, trying to block it out. When I opened them, something was on the floor. It was her scarf. The same green scarf she'd been wearing the day we went hiking last fall, just weeks before the accident. I hadn't packed it, hadn't seen it in months. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the fabric soft and worn. A faint smell of lavender, her favorite scent, lingered on it. My chest tightened. "Lauren?" The RV felt smaller, the air heavier. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping voices speaking words I couldn't understand. I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the door, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. The grove was waiting. I don't know why I went back. Maybe it was the voice, or the scarf, or the part of me that refused to let her go. The trail felt longer this time, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The flashlight's beam barely pierced the shadows, and the whispers grew louder with every step. When I reached the grove, the trees were alive. Their branches twisted and writhed, casting jagged shadows against the ground. The carvings on the bark glowed faintly, their shapes shifting as I watched. At the center of the grove stood a figure. It was tall and skeletal, its body a patchwork of bark, moss, and rotted flesh. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its head tilted unnaturally as it watched me. My legs locked in place, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Mark," it whispered in Lauren's voice. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. The branches above seemed to reach for it, bowing as if drawn to its presence. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. "You left me," it said, the voice shifting to something deeper, more guttural. "You'll stay with me now." The whispers surged, filling my ears with an unbearable noise. The figure raised an arm, its hand a tangle of roots and bone, reaching for me. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam shaking wildly. "No!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. The carvings, the symbols on the trees, they were the key. I reached for the knife in my pack and slashed at the nearest carving, cutting through the bark. The glowing symbol flickered and the whispers faltered. The figure shrieked, a sound that pierced through my skull. Its form wavered, the branches above thrashing violently. I slashed at another carving, then another, the glowing symbols fading with each cut. The grove erupted in chaos. The figure staggered back, its hollow eyes burning brighter before dimming. The air grew colder, the ground shaken beneath my feet. I turned and ran, the screams of the grove fading behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in the RV, the door slamming shut behind me. My hands were bleeding, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The forest was silent again. The oppressive weight lifted. At dawn, I packed my things and left Savage Gulch, the twisted grove disappearing in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. The scarf was still in my pocket, a reminder of what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen. Maybe the grove was real. Maybe it wasn't. But as I drove away, I felt lighter, as if some part of me had finally let go. Lauren's voice hasn't called to me since, but sometimes when the wind whispers through the trees, I think I hear her laugh. The first thing I noticed about Daniel Boone National Forest was how silent it was. Not the pleasant stillness of a forest at peace, but something heavier, oppressive. Even the wind seemed to skirt around the towering pines, leaving the air unnaturally still. I pulled my RV into a small clearing far from the main campground. This part of the forest was supposed to be abandoned, the trails overgrown, the land left to reclaim itself. I'd read about it in an old ranger log during my years working the parks. Something about this area stuck with me, and now, years later, I had to see it for myself. As I stepped out of the RV, the air felt dense, as though the forest was waiting for something. Maybe it was my guilt playing tricks on me. It had been over a decade since the disappearance, since a young camper had vanished on my watch, never to be found. The memory haunted me, a weight I carried into every forest I visited. This place, though, it felt different. I spent the first day walking the trails, or what was left of them. The forest had reclaimed much of the land, moss creeping over fallen signs and ferns sprouting through cracks in forgotten pathways. It wasn't long before I found the first carving. Etched into the bark of a towering pine was a strange symbol, angular and deliberate. It wasn't graffiti, not the kind you'd expect from bored kids. This had purpose. The lines were too clean, too precise. I ran my fingers over the grooves, wondering who had made it and why. As the day wore on, I found more carvings, each one different but sharing the same sharp, geometric style. They were etched into rocks, tree trunks, even the remains of an old wooden post. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, though that was absurd, wasn't it? I stumbled across the abandoned campsite just before dusk. It was little more than a collection of rotted canvas and rusted gear, half buried beneath a thick layer of leaves. The smell of damp earth clung to the air, and my boots crunched over brittle fragments of what might have been a backpack. Something caught my eye, a metal frame poking out of the dirt. I crouched and pulled out a rusted camp stove. My stomach twisted as I realized what I was looking at. This was it. This was the camper's site, the one I'd never found. My hands shook as I sifted through the debris, finding remnants of a life cut short, a torn map, the cover faded and unreadable, a pair of hiking boots, one missing its sole. And then I saw it. A journal, its cover warped and moldy. I opened it, careful not to tear the fragile pages. The writing was faint, but the last entry was legible enough to chill me to my core. Something watches me. I see it in the trees, just beyond the firelight. It doesn't come close, but I know it's there. The warden, they call it. God help me. The sun was dipping below the trees when I made it back to the RV. The shadows stretched long and deep, their edges blurring into the encroaching darkness. That night, the footsteps started. They circled the RV, slow and deliberate, crunching softly over the fallen leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the gloom. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. No response. The footsteps stopped. I scanned the clearing, but nothing moved. The carvings on the nearby trees seemed sharper in the dim light, their lines glowing faintly as if etched with moonlight. I retreated inside, locking the door behind me. But sleep didn't come. By morning, I found claw marks gouged into the RV's side. They weren't the kind left by an animal. These were long, deliberate slashes, each one equidistant, as though measured. I followed the trail of disturbed leaves and broken twigs that led away from the RV, deeper into the forest. They ended at the edge of a hollow, the ground sloping sharply into a shadowed gorge. The air was different here, thicker, heavier. The trees seemed older, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The hum of insects and distant birds fell silent as I approached, replaced by an eerie stillness. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the base of the hollow, cloaked in shadow. Its form was indistinct, blending with the trees, but its eyes, they glowed. Pale and piercing, they locked onto me with an intensity that froze me in place. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, a weight pressing against my lungs. I turned and ran. That night, I dreamed of the camper. I saw their face clearly for the first time in years, their expression frozen in fear. Behind them, the warden loomed, its shadow wrapping around them like smoke. I woke with a start, the image burned into my mind. Outside, the forest glowed faintly, illuminated by an unnatural silvery light. The warden was there, standing just beyond the clearing, its eyes fixed on me. "You abandoned them," a voice whispered, low and rustling, like wind through leaves. I clutched my head, the words stabbing into my mind. The voice didn't come from outside. It was inside me, forcing me to relive every decision, every mistake I'd made that day. I remembered the campers' desperate calls for help, the storm that had driven me to call off the search, the gnawing guilt that had eaten at me ever since. "You left the forest," the voice hissed, "but it has not forgotten." The next day, I knew what I had to do. I returned to the hollow, the journal and carvings heavy in my pack. The warden's presence pressed against me as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the base of the hollow, I found a crude altar made of stone and twisted branches. The carvings etched into it matched the symbols on the trees, their meaning unknowable but powerful. The warden appeared, its form flickering like a shadow caught between dimensions. "I failed," I said, my voice trembling. "I failed them, and I've carried that guilt every day since. But I'm here now. If you want judgment, take it." The warden stepped closer, its glowing eyes boring into me. The air around me shimmered, and for a moment I saw visions: polluted rivers, scarred landscapes, and broken ecosystems. The forest's voice spoke again, louder this time. "You will protect what you once abandoned." The warden reached out, its shadowy hand brushing against my arm. A searing pain shot through me, and I gasped, falling to my knees. When I looked down, a symbol was burned into my skin, the same angular design from the carvings. The warden faded, the heavy silence lifting with its departure. For the first time, the forest felt alive again. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the air smelled of pine and earth. I left the hollow, the mark on my arm pulsing faintly. As I drove away, I realized I'd been given a second chance, not just to atone, but to protect the wilderness I'd always loved. The warden's voice lingered in my mind, a reminder of the promise I'd made, to guard the forest as it had once guarded me. I should have trusted my instincts when I first pulled into Deschutes National Forest. Something about the silence didn't sit right. It wasn't the peaceful quiet you hope for when escaping to nature. This was heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath, but I dismissed it. I was here for the isolation after all. I parked my RV by a secluded lake, the water so still it looked like glass. The nearest campground was miles away, and I had no cell service. Perfect. A week of photographing untouched landscapes and not speaking to another soul. I stepped out of the RV, breathing in the pine-scented air. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering trees, casting long shadows. A faint breeze rustled the needles above, but the lake remained eerily still. As I set up my camera for some golden hour shots, I noticed my watch had stopped. Annoyed, I pulled out my phone to check the time, only to see the clock jump ahead by 3 hours in the blink of an eye. I frowned, chalking it up to a glitch. Technology had a way of failing at the worst times. Then I saw the lights. They were faint at first, hovering just above the treetops on the far side of the lake. I assumed they were satellites or maybe drones, but they didn't move like either. They pulsed in a slow, deliberate rhythm, shifting from blue to green to white. I grabbed my camera, adjusting the lens to zoom in. As I focused, the lights blinked out, leaving me staring at an empty tree line. "Great," I muttered. "Perfect timing." That night, the hum started. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a low-frequency vibration that you felt more than heard. Lying in bed, I tried to ignore it, but it seemed to grow louder the more I focused on it. Eventually, I slipped into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I set out on foot with my camera gear. The trail around the lake was narrow and overgrown, but the views were worth it. Early sunlight reflected off the water, the surrounding forest bathed in soft gold. I was so absorbed in framing a shot that I almost missed the first sign of something strange. A circle of scorched earth in the middle of the trail. The soil was blackened, the vegetation around it untouched. "What the hell?" I muttered, crouching to take a closer look. The air smelled faintly of ozone, sharp and electric. I snapped a few photos, marking the spot in my notes. As I moved deeper into the forest, I found more strange markers. Trees with bark stripped in perfect vertical lines, piles of smooth black stones arranged in unnatural patterns. Each discovery set me further on edge, but my curiosity kept me moving forward. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting and the hum was back. This time it wasn't faint. It resonated in my chest, as though the forest itself was vibrating. I sat by the lake, trying to capture the last light of the day. That's when the lights returned. They hovered, closer this time, just above the tree line on my side of the lake. They pulsed faster, their colors more vibrant. I grabbed my camera, snapping shot after shot. Then everything went black. When I woke, I was lying in the middle of the forest. My head throbbed and my clothes were damp with morning dew. My camera was beside me, the strap tangled around a branch. Disoriented, I stumbled to my feet, trying to remember how I'd gotten there. The last thing I recalled was the lights. The sun was rising, casting long shadows through the trees. My watch was missing, and my phone's clock read 8:13 a.m., a full 9 hours unaccounted for. I flipped through my camera, hoping the photos might jog my memory. The images were wrong. The first few were normal shots of the lake, but then the frames became distorted, the colors bleeding into unnatural hues. One showed the forest bathed in a sickly green light, with faint humanoid silhouettes in the distance. Another captured what looked like a circle of orbs hovering around a central, pulsating glow. I dropped the camera, my stomach twisting. Back at the RV, I found my journal on the table. Its pages were filled with entries I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was mine, but the words didn't feel like something I'd written. The light calls, I must follow. Time bends, the path loops. They are watching. I flipped to the last page where a crude map of the forest had been drawn, marking a specific spot deep in the woods. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I had to know what was happening. That night, the lights returned. They descended slowly, illuminating the forest in an otherworldly glow. The hum grew louder, a deafening pulse that drowned out my thoughts. I grabbed my flashlight and followed them, feeling both terrified and drawn by an inexplicable pull. The forest felt alive around me, the air charged with static electricity. I reached a clearing, the same one marked in the journal. The ground was scorched in concentric circles, the vegetation around it untouched. At the center stood a figure. It was humanoid, but blurred, as though it existed slightly out of phase with reality. Its edges shimmered, shifting in and out of focus. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure turned toward me, and I was overwhelmed by a wave of vertigo. The forest spun, the trees bending inward as though collapsing into a singular point. The figure raised a hand, and the world went black again. When I woke, I was back in the RV. The hum was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. My camera and phone were missing, replaced by a small metallic object etched with symbols I couldn't decipher. The forest felt different, as though the air had been drained of its weight. I stepped outside, half expecting the lights to return, but the sky was clear. My watch was on the ground near the door, its face cracked and hands frozen. Checking my phone, I realized 3 days had passed since I'd last remembered being awake. I tried to leave, but the gravel road I'd driven in on now looped back to the campsite no matter which direction I took. Desperation set in as I drove in circles, the forest closing in tighter each time. In the end, I returned to the clearing, the metallic object in my hand. I placed it at the center of the scorched circles, hoping it would end whatever hold the forest had on me. The lights appeared almost immediately, descending in perfect unison. The figure materialized again, its form sharper this time. It didn't speak, but I felt its presence in my mind, a flood of images and sensations I couldn't comprehend. Time folded around me, memories warping and fracturing. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. Driving away, the road stretched endlessly ahead, the forest finally letting me go. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I noticed faint symbols etched along my temple, matching those on the metallic object. I don't know what they mean, but I know I'll never forget what happened in Deschutes National Forest. Some things can't be explained. The Ozarks felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. The winding roads, the heavy canopy of trees, the distant sound of running water. It all tugged at something buried deep in my mind. I wasn't sure why I'd chosen this place or even this trip, but after the accident, I needed a reset, something to make me feel normal again. The creek was exactly as I imagined it, calm, quiet, and untouched. I parked my RV on a patch of flat ground near the bank, its water so still it looked like glass. The faint rush of a nearby waterfall was the only sound. It was perfect. Peaceful. But peace has a way of unsettling you when you don't trust it. The first day passed uneventfully. I set up camp, unpacked my camera, and spent the afternoon wandering along the creek, snapping photos of the overgrown forest and the sunlight filtering through the trees. The air smelled clean, and for the first time in months, I felt a sliver of calm. That night, the silence became oppressive. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Even the creek seemed to have stilled. I sat in the RV with my journal, writing down notes from the day. It felt good to document something again, to try and focus my scattered thoughts. But the moment I set my pen down, I realized I'd forgotten what I'd written. The page was there, the words clear, but it was like they didn't belong to me. I chalked it up to my head injury. This kind of thing happened sometimes, forgetting words mid-sentence, losing chunks of time. It was nothing new, but something about the way the words sat on the page, strange and foreign, left me uneasy. The next morning, I found the carvings. They were on a boulder near the edge of the creek, faint but deliberate. Lines etched into the rock formed shapes, circles, symbols, even a name. Sam, my name. I frowned, running my fingers over the letters. The edges were weathered, worn down by time, as if they'd been there for decades. But that didn't make sense. I stepped back, taking in the surrounding area. The trees felt taller here, their branches crowding the sky. The creek's stillness mirrored everything too perfectly, like it was swallowing the world in its reflection. My reflection stared back at me from the water, but something was wrong. The man in the water seemed off. His face too sharp, his eyes too dark. I stumbled away, my pulse quickening. "It's just my head," I muttered. "It's just my head." But the air felt heavier, as if the forest was watching. By midday, the small lapses in memory grew worse. I'd taken my camera out to photograph the carvings, but when I returned to the RV, the photos were gone. The memory card was empty, and my camera displayed nothing but static. My journal was missing too, and when I searched the RV, I found it stuffed under the driver's seat. The words inside weren't mine. "It's taken me." I stared at the sentence, written in shaky handwriting that looked like my own. My chest tightened as I flipped through the pages, seeing entry after entry I didn't remember writing. They described places I hadn't been, people I hadn't met, moments I couldn't recall. I tossed the journal aside and stepped outside, the sunlight almost blinding after the dimness of the RV. I needed air. I needed to think. But when I looked down, I saw something that sent chills down my spine. There were footprints in the dirt, bare, human prints leading to the creek and stopping at its edge. That night, the laughter began. It was faint at first, echoing through the trees like the memory of a sound. A child's laughter, light and playful, but wrong. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the laughter grew louder, closer until it seemed to circle the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my breath catching in my throat. The air was colder than it should have been, and the world seemed muted, the colors washed out. I swept the flashlight across the trees, catching glimpses of movement, shadows flickering just out of reach. "Hello?" My voice trembled, barely louder than a whisper. The laughter stopped. I turned toward the creek and froze. A child stood at the water's edge, their figure faint and shimmering like a mirage. They looked up at me, their face indistinct but eerily familiar. Then they stepped into the creek, their reflection rippling and breaking apart before vanishing beneath the surface. The next morning, I found the journal again. This time it was on the picnic table outside the RV, open to a page I didn't remember writing. The words blurred as I tried to read them, but one sentence stood out, bold and sharp: "Do not touch the water." I slammed the journal shut and shoved it into my bag. The day passed in a haze of unease. I tried to distract myself with hiking, venturing deeper into the forest, but every path seemed to loop back to the creek. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the smell of waterlogged wood clung to everything. I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite in the late afternoon. A collapsed tent sat near a fire pit filled with ash, and a rusted camping stove lay half buried in the dirt. A backpack leaned against a tree, its contents scattered. Clothes, a broken lantern, and a photograph. The photo made my stomach lurch. It was me, standing by the creek, holding my camera. I didn't remember taking it. That night, the spirit came for me. I woke to the sound of rushing water, louder than I'd ever heard it. The RV shuddered as if caught in a current, though it sat firmly on dry ground. I stumbled outside, flashlight in hand, and froze. The creek was alive, its surface churning and glowing faintly. The child stood at its center, their form flickering like a dying flame. Behind them, the water rose, twisting into the shape of a woman. Her face was hollow, her eyes dark pits that bore into mine. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, as if carried on the wind, a voice whispered in my ear, "You don't belong here." I staggered back, my heart racing. The child stepped forward, reaching for me, and I felt the pull, a sudden, overwhelming urge to step into the water. My feet moved on their own, the world around me blurring into a haze of sound and light. But then I remembered. The carving on the rock, my name, the memory of my father and our trips to the Ozarks, his laughter as we skipped stones across a creek just like this one. It was faint, like a flickering candle, but it was enough. I tore myself away from the water, stumbling back to the RV. The spirit's wail followed me, a sound of anguish that echoed through the forest. I slammed the door shut and didn't look back. By dawn, the creek was calm again, its surface smooth as glass. I started the RV and drove away, the forest fading in my mirrors. The journal sat on the passenger seat, its pages blank. But as I reached the main road, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, it wasn't my face staring back at me. It was hers. The Ozarks felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. The winding roads, the heavy canopy of trees, the distant sound of running water. It all tugged at something buried deep in my mind. I wasn't sure why I'd chosen this place or even this trip, but after the accident, I needed a reset, something to make me feel normal again. The creek was exactly as I imagined it, calm, quiet and untouched. I parked my RV on a patch of flat ground near the bank, its water so still it looked like glass. The faint rush of a nearby waterfall was the only sound. It was perfect. Peaceful. But peace has a way of unsettling you when you don't trust it. The first day passed uneventfully. I set up camp, unpacked my camera, and spent the afternoon wandering along the creek, snapping photos of the overgrown forest and the sunlight filtering through the trees. The air smelled clean, and for the first time in months, I felt a sliver of calm. That night, the silence became oppressive. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Even the creek seemed to have stilled. I sat in the RV with my journal, writing down notes from the day. It felt good to document something again, to try and focus my scattered thoughts. But the moment I set my pen down, I realized I'd forgotten what I'd written. The page was there, the words clear, but it was like they didn't belong to me. I chalked it up to my head injury. This kind of thing happened sometimes, forgetting words mid-sentence, losing chunks of time. It was nothing new, but something about the way the words sat on the page, strange and foreign, left me uneasy. The next morning, I found the carvings. They were on a boulder near the edge of the creek, faint but deliberate. Lines etched into the rock formed shapes, circles, symbols, even a name. Sam, my name. I frowned, running my fingers over the letters. The edges were weathered, worn down by time, as if they'd been there for decades. But that didn't make sense. I stepped back, taking in the surrounding area. The trees felt taller here, their branches crowding the sky. The creek's stillness mirrored everything too perfectly, like it was swallowing the world in its reflection. My reflection stared back at me from the water, but something was wrong. The man in the water seemed off. His face too sharp, his eyes too dark. I stumbled away, my pulse quickening. "It's just my head," I muttered. "It's just my head." But the air felt heavier, as if the forest was watching. By midday, the small lapses in memory grew worse. I'd taken my camera out to photograph the carvings, but when I returned to the RV, the photos were gone. The memory card was empty, and my camera displayed nothing but static. My journal was missing too, and when I searched the RV, I found it stuffed under the driver's seat. The words inside weren't mine. "It's taken me." I stared at the sentence, written in shaky handwriting that looked like my own. My chest tightened as I flipped through the pages, seeing entry after entry I didn't remember writing. They described places I hadn't been, people I hadn't met, moments I couldn't recall. I tossed the journal aside and stepped outside, the sunlight almost blinding after the dimness of the RV. I needed air. I needed to think. But when I looked down, I saw something that sent chills down my spine. There were footprints in the dirt, bare, human prints leading to the creek and stopping at its edge. That night, the laughter began. It was faint at first, echoing through the trees like the memory of a sound. A child's laughter, light and playful, but wrong. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the laughter grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my breath catching in my throat. The air was colder than it should have been, and the world seemed muted, the colors washed out. I swept the flashlight across the trees, catching glimpses of movement, shadows flickering just out of reach. "Hello?" My voice trembled, barely louder than a whisper. The laughter stopped. I turned toward the creek and froze. A child stood at the water's edge, their figure faint and shimmering like a mirage. They looked up at me, their face indistinct but eerily familiar. Then they stepped into the creek, their reflection rippling and breaking apart before vanishing beneath the surface. The next morning, I found the journal again. This time it was on the picnic table outside the RV, open to a page I didn't remember writing. The words blurred as I tried to read them, but one sentence stood out, bold and sharp: "Do not touch the water." I slammed the journal shut and shoved it into my bag. The day passed in a haze of unease. I tried to distract myself with hiking, venturing deeper into the forest, but every path seemed to loop back to the creek. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the smell of waterlogged wood clung to everything. I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite in the late afternoon. A collapsed tent sat near a fire pit filled with ash, and a rusted camping stove lay half buried in the dirt. A backpack leaned against a tree, its contents scattered. Clothes, a broken lantern, and a photograph. The photo made my stomach lurch. It was me, standing by the creek, holding my camera. I didn't remember taking it. That night, the spirit came for me. I woke to the sound of rushing water, louder than I'd ever heard it. The RV shuddered as if caught in a current, though it sat firmly on dry ground. I stumbled outside, flashlight in hand, and froze. The creek was alive, its surface churning and glowing faintly. The child stood at its center, their form flickering like a dying flame. Behind them, the water rose, twisting into the shape of a woman. Her face was hollow, her eyes dark pits that bore into mine. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, as if carried on the wind, a voice whispered in my ear, "You don't belong here." I staggered back, my heart racing. The child stepped forward, reaching for me, and I felt the pull, a sudden, overwhelming urge to step into the water. My feet moved on their own, the world around me blurring into a haze of sound and light. But then I remembered. The carving on the rock, my name, the memory of my father and our trips to the Ozarks, his laughter as we skipped stones across a creek just like this one. It was faint, like a flickering candle, but it was enough. I tore myself away from the water, stumbling back to the RV. The spirit's wail followed me, a sound of anguish that echoed through the forest. I slammed the door shut and didn't look back. By dawn, the creek was calm again, its surface smooth as glass. I started the RV and drove away, the forest fading in my mirrors. The journal sat on the passenger seat, its pages blank. But as I reached the main road, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, it wasn't my face staring back at me. It was hers. The air smelled like smoke, not the kind that wafts from a campfire, but the acrid, stinging scent of destruction. I rolled down the window of the RV and breathed in deep, my stomach twisting with the memory it brought back. It wasn't real, I told myself, just a phantom from the past. Sequoia National Forest stretched out before me, its green canopy dotted with the blackened scars of the wildfire that had changed everything. It had been 6 years since the blaze, the one that had ended my career as a firefighter and left me limping through the rest of my life, both physically and emotionally. I parked the RV near the edge of the burn zone, a desolate stretch where skeletal trees reached like charred fingers toward the sky. This trip was supposed to be about closure, documenting the regrowth, confronting the guilt I'd carried for years. But as I stepped out onto the dry, cracked soil, I felt the weight of the forest pressing against my chest, heavy and unrelenting. The first day was uneventful, at least on the surface. I spent hours hiking through the burn zone, snapping photos of stubborn saplings pushing through the ash, of flowers blooming where fire had once raged. The juxtaposition of life and death was striking, almost poetic. But the forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds called from the trees. No insects buzzed in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed muted, rushing past me like it didn't want to be noticed. The only sound was the crunch of my boots against the ground. That night, the smell of smoke returned. I sat at the small table inside the RV, flipping through the photos I'd taken when it hit me, sharp and unmistakable. I checked the stove, the generator, even the wiring, but everything was fine. Outside, the stars glittered against a black sky, the landscape calm and still. But the smell lingered, wrapping itself around me like an accusation. I barely slept. The second day, the forest felt different. The burn zone stretched on endlessly, its twisted, blackened trees like sentinels guarding some ancient secret. As I hiked deeper, the air grew colder and the ground beneath my boots turned to ash. My breath came out in visible puffs, even though it was late summer. Then I saw it. A faint trail of ash snaking through the trees, leading deeper into the forest. It hadn't been there the day before. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity won out. I followed the trail. The air grew heavier as I walked, the silence deeper. The ash clung to my boots, and the shadows of the trees seemed to shift and twist, though the sun was high overhead. I reached a clearing where the ash trail ended abruptly, spiraling into a strange, circular pattern on the ground. In the center lay something metallic. It was a firefighter's badge, warped and blackened from the heat. My stomach lurched as I picked it up. The number etched into its surface matched the one I'd worn during the wildfire. I dropped it and ran back to the RV. That night, the forest came alive. The lights inside the RV flickered as I sat at the table, clutching a cup of coffee like it could anchor me to reality. The air felt charged, electric, like the moments before a lightning strike. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, blending with the hum of the generator, but they grew louder, more distinct, a chorus of voices overlapping, murmuring words I couldn't understand. My name cut through the noise, clear and sharp. Liam! I froze, my blood turning to ice. The lights flickered again, and the temperature in the RV plummeted. The whispers grew frantic, insistent, filling the air like a rising tide. The smell of smoke grew so strong it burned my throat, and then the RV shook. It wasn't subtle, a violent jolt that knocked the coffee cup from my hands and sent it shattering to the floor. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled to the door, throwing it open. The forest was dark, the trees swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. But there, at the edge of the burn zone, were the shadows. They stood motionless, humanoid but indistinct, their forms flickering like smoke caught in a draft. My heart pounded as I stared, the flashlight trembling in my hand. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements fluid and deliberate. It raised an arm, pointing toward the forest, toward the center of the burn zone. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers faded with the dawn, leaving me drained and trembling. The badge was back on the table, even though I'd left it in the clearing. By the third day, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was haunting the forest wasn't going to let me leave, not until I faced it. I packed a bag, grabbed the flashlight, and set out toward the heart of the burn zone. The trail was different now, the landscape more desolate. The ground was black and brittle, crumbling beneath my boots with every step. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and the shadows seemed to close in around me, pressing against my vision like a living thing. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and with it came the sound of crackling flames. I stopped, spinning in place, but there was no fire, only the illusion of it, licking at the edges of my vision. Figures moved in the distance, their shapes blurred by the phantom heat. When I finally reached the center of the burn zone, the air was so thick I could barely breathe. The clearing was a wasteland of ash and charred earth. At its center stood a massive blackened tree, its branches stretching skyward like twisted arms. Smoke seeped from the ground around its roots, curling upward in tendrils that coalesced into a towering figure. The spirit was immense, its form shifting between smoke and ember, its eyes two glowing coals that bore into me. Its presence was suffocating, filling the air with an oppressive heat that burned without touching. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that echoed in my skull. "You let us burn." The voice wasn't singular. It was many, overlapping and merging, each word laced with anger and sorrow. Images flooded my mind, faces twisted in fear, hands reaching through flames, a forest consumed by fire. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, gasping for air. "I tried," I choked out. "I did everything I could." The spirit loomed closer, its form pulsating with rage. The ground beneath me burned, but I couldn't move. The voices pressed against my mind, pulling me into the past, forcing me to relive every moment of the wildfire. The heat, the chaos, the screams, the lives I couldn't save. "You failed." Tears streamed down my face as I clutched the badge, the metal searing against my palm. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." The spirit paused, its form flickering. The voices softened, the anger ebbing into something like sorrow. The air grew still, and for a moment the world held its breath. "Carry our story." The words were soft, almost gentle. The spirit began to dissolve, its form unraveling into smoke that drifted upward, carried away on an unseen wind. The temperature rose and the whispers faded into silence. The forest was empty again. When I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, casting the burn zone in a golden glow. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. I started the engine and drove away, the scarred landscape disappearing in the rearview mirror. I still smell the smoke sometimes, faint and lingering, a reminder of what happened in the forest. But I've made my peace with it. The guilt is still there, but so is the promise I made, to carry their story, to honor the lives lost in the flames. And when I close my eyes, I can still see the spirit, its amber eyes watching from the shadows. I'd heard of ghost towns before, but Silver Vale was different. The name came up in whispers, tucked away in a dusty corner of a conversation with a gas station clerk on the edge of Saguaro National Park. When I mentioned my passion for photographing abandoned places, his expression darkened. "You don't want to go to Silver Vale," he said. "People don't come back from there." I laughed it off, chalking it up to small-town superstition. That night, back in the RV, I scoured online forums and found little about the town. A few rumors, a faded map, and some vague warnings. It was perfect. Uncharted, mysterious, and photogenic. I had to see it. The drive to Silver Vale wasn't easy. The dirt path leading there was little more than a scar across the desert, twisting through rocky hills and cacti that seemed to reach for the sky. The RV's engine strained on the incline, the tires kicking up dust that billowed in the mirrors like smoke. When I crested the final hill, the town spread out before me like a relic frozen in time. Wooden buildings, sun-bleached and crumbling, lined a single dusty street. An old saloon leaned precariously to one side, its sign swaying in the hot breeze. A church sat at the far end, its steeple jagged as if lightning had split it in two. I parked the RV near what looked like a general store and grabbed my camera. The air was eerily still, the usual desert hum of insects conspicuously absent. It was as if the world had been muted. The first building I entered was the saloon. Sunlight streamed through the slats in the roof, painting stripes across the dusty floor. A long bar ran the length of the room, and chairs sat neatly arranged around tables, as if the patrons had just stepped out for a smoke. My boots kicked up small clouds of dust as I moved through the space, the creak of the floorboards loud in the silence. I framed a shot of the bar, adjusting the focus to catch the cracked mirror behind it. As I clicked the shutter, a faint sound echoed through the room, the scrape of wood on wood. I spun around, my heart hammering, but the room was empty. One of the chairs near the door had shifted slightly, its legs dragging a line through the dust. I told myself it was the wind, though I hadn't felt any. I spent the afternoon exploring the town, moving from building to building. The general store was stocked with rusted cans and broken jars, their labels faded to illegibility. The schoolhouse had desks lined in neat rows, their surfaces etched with the doodles of long-gone students. The church was the most intact, its pews still standing, though the altar was cracked and scorched. It was as if the town had been abandoned overnight, leaving everything behind. And yet, there were no signs of wildlife. No bird droppings, no nests, not even a stray lizard. Just emptiness. The silence began to weigh on me, pressing against my ears like cotton. I decided to call it a day and headed back to the RV. The first night, the knocking started. I was lying on the narrow cot, flipping through the photos on my camera. The images were crisp and haunting. The crooked steeple of the church, the dusty rows of the schoolhouse, the shattered glass of a storefront window. Each shot was perfect. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against the RV door. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera's display. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I swung the door open and shone the flashlight into the dark. The beam illuminated the empty street, the buildings casting long, jagged shadows under the pale moonlight. The silence was oppressive, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I stepped outside, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved, but when I turned back to the RV, I saw them. Footprints in the dust, leading to the door and stopping abruptly. The second day, things got stranger. I returned to the saloon to reshoot some of the photos I wasn't happy with. As I adjusted my tripod, I noticed something in the mirror behind the bar. A figure, faint and indistinct, standing near the door. I whipped around, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. Breathing heavily, I packed up my gear and moved to another building, determined to shake the unease. In the general store, I found a journal lying on the counter, its cover cracked and brittle. The entries were written in Lupin cursive, describing the final days of the town. People are disappearing. The mine is cursed. The ground groans at night, and shadows move where no light touches. We should leave, but we can't. Something won't let us. The entry ended abruptly. The last line scrawled so violently the pen had torn the page. I shoved the journal into my bag and hurried back to the RV. That night, the knocking returned. Louder this time, more insistent. I sat frozen on the cot, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The knocking turned to scratching, nails dragging against the metal door in long, deliberate strokes. "Leave me alone," I shouted, but the scratching didn't stop. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I saw them, shadows moving between the buildings, flickering in and out of view like candle flames. They were humanoid, but wrong, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The scratching stopped, but the RV felt colder, as if the desert itself had turned against me. On the third day, I made the mistake of entering the mine. The journal had mentioned it, describing strange sounds and the disappearance of miners in its depths. I should have left well enough alone, but my curiosity outweighed my fear. The mine entrance was at the edge of town, a gaping black maw in the side of the hill. The air grew colder as I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The walls were lined with rusted tracks and broken tools, remnants of the town's once thriving industry. Deeper inside, the air grew heavier, and the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustle of leaves, but they grew louder as I pressed on. Voices murmuring in a language I didn't understand, overlapping and echoing in the tight space. I reached a chamber at the heart of the mine where the air was so cold I could see my breath. In the center of the room was a pile of bones, human remains, shattered and scattered, their hollow sockets staring accusingly. The whispers turned to screams. I ran. The shadows followed, their forms twisting and writhing in the corners of my vision. The mine seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter as I stumbled through the darkness. By the time I burst into the open air, my legs were shaking and my chest burned with every breath. The RV was waiting at the edge of town, its lights flickering weakly. I threw myself inside and slammed the door, collapsing onto the floor. The shadows gathered outside, pressing against the windows, their forms indistinct but menacing. And then I heard her voice. Bryce. It was soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. My wife. She'd been gone for over a year, but the sound of her voice was etched into my soul. Bryce, come outside. Tears streamed down my face as I pressed my back against the door, shaking my head. You're not real. The voice grew louder, insistent. Come outside, Bryce, please. The shadows began to seep through the cracks, their forms stretching toward me like smoke. My breath hitched, and I clutched my wife's locket around my neck, whispering a desperate apology. By the time the sun rose, the shadows were gone. I didn't wait to see if they'd return. I started the RV and drove until the town disappeared in the rearview mirror, its jagged buildings swallowed by the hills. My hands trembled on the wheel, and I couldn't stop glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see the shadows chasing me. When I finally stopped to breathe, miles from Silver Vale, I checked the photos on my camera. Most were as I'd left them, eerie, haunting shots of the ghost town. But in the last photo, taken in the mine, I saw them. Shadowy figures with hollow eyes, staring directly at the lens. I deleted the photo, but the memory remains. Some places aren't meant to be found, and some histories are better left buried.